Alrighty, random car talk. Guess if we're numbering these, number one. In this episode, we're going to be talking about did I forget? Or am I building suspense? I bet you'd love to know. I'm going to stop looking at the camera now. Well, yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the role of the ego in spiritual development. Just some thoughts, a thought talk on the subject. And both from the perspective of an individual's personal development, like their own self-journey by themselves, as well as from the perspective of like a coach or leader who is teaching principles to someone in the self-development field, and how the ego plays a role both in the teacher and the student in those kind of situations. So I'll roll up the window so potentially you can actually hear me, and we'll get started. So the first thing I wanted to do is differentiate between the idea of the ego and the higher self. And the concept is pretty clear, and I think in a video a little maybe earlier today, I talk about the polarities of love and fear, and I feel like these are very much related, because the polarity of fear also encompasses certainty, and the ego is all about certainty. And in being all about certainty, the ego is a very untruthful entity, because real certainty is very rare, or perhaps doesn't exist. There's high probability, but certainty is a different story. There's very high probability, and there's wisdom based on experience, and there's recurring events that are likely to continue recurring. But just because the sun has risen throughout your entire life and presumably all of human history, doesn't mean it's going to rise tomorrow. It really doesn't. There's no certainty there that we're assured of past our past experience and current understandings, which potentially could be flawed. But given that, we use that information. The ego is a valuable mechanism or tool or within us or part of us, because it's able to function in a practical way. Even if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow, the idea and the behaving in a way that it will, based on past experience and just the flow of the world, is a reasonable thing to do from a practical perspective, and it is necessary on some level. But the identification with the ego as basically an idol, as something that is super awesome, that is guiding you and helping you, and it knows all the answers, and anything outside of its understanding is dumb or unreasonable or whatever. That itself is actually a product of the ego, because the ego is going to, one of the interesting things about it is that it will, a large part of its existence is about self-preservation, and the self it intends to preserve is very physical and biological self. So the ego can influence you to act in ways that are contrary to your higher self, your more personal true self. The self that makes decisions, that has willpower, that can act in contrary to programming and such things like that. The self that can't do that is the ego. Is basically like a machine that operates inside you, a very complex machine-like entity, but very nuanced and very deep, so it doesn't feel like a machine. It feels like a voice, a person, a you. So this is the idea of the ego versus the higher self. So we've talked about the ego, and how do you identify the ego? Is this fear, certainty, desire, and a kind of neediness is all very much elements or energies associated with the ego. The higher self, on the other hand, doesn't have a strong emotional pull. There could be emotions around it, but the core of it is much more quiet and knowingful. And so it's difficult to hear the voice of your higher self because the ego is so loud and obvious, both in terms of feelings and emotions, and also as well in terms of just like thoughts in your minds, feelings, emotions, and even physical sensations. I think that the nervous system isn't like a function of the ego, but that it is very heavily influenced by the ego. So if your ego is telling you, you know, that something's scary for a long period of time in your life, your nervous system is going to take that in, and you'll physiologically react as if something's scary, even if at some point your mind or your spirit lets go of that fear and says, okay, that's not actually something to be afraid of, I realize this now. But you'll physiologically and even mentally, the thoughts will come up that are fearful, because your brain is actually an extension of your central nervous system, and you've got all these myelinated pathways that are like repeated thoughts and feelings and ideas that are just really easy to access and are like kind of automatically triggered by things in your environment usually, or even your own thoughts. So having that, like, your ego can basically train your nervous system and mind to have certain thought and feeling patterns. And then even if you let go of those thought and feeling patterns consciously and spiritually, your body might still react in that way for a while until it's been remyelinated, until the nervous system has had the time to catch up to the changes that on a metaphysical level can happen instantly, potentially, though that's not always the case, of course. So you've got the higher self, which is this. We won't talk about the origins or anything like that, because I feel like that's a very deep and its own topic of discussion that requires its own set of time. But assuming that there's this faculty within you that's non-physical, that's capable of like consciousness, reason, maybe just awareness, maybe it doesn't, maybe the logic and the reason and everything is more on the ego side, and then the higher self is actually just a like an impulse or a like pre-verbal understanding and knowing and guidance, and then the ego translates if it's working for you and not against you, or if it's working for you and you're not working for your ego, then the ego should listen to the higher self, interpret that in a practical way, and then you'd be able to take action or connect with that higher self in the real world, in your thoughts and whatever. Now, switching to the perspective of someone teaching someone else, or someone trying to impart some wisdom or whatever, if that comes from a place of ego, usually I think you can assume, not always, but I think you can assume the student is going to come from a place of ego. The learner wants to learn something, and just wanting to learn something, thinking that there's something missing that you need to obtain, that you need to learn or develop, that you're not like perfect and complete in and of yourself. You can still learn and develop with an understanding that you're perfect and complete, but you're still growing and evolving. But if you're usually coming to personal development stuff, it's a bit more of an ego thing, where you're like, okay, I want to be different, in some way. And so if you meet that person with ego, then it becomes an ego battle, and whoever's ego is strongest, which if you're like a life coach or a powerful speaker or a very influential person, just like in the way that you are or whatever, then you can like out-ego someone and kind of convince them on an ego level to do something or to think something or believe something. But then it just becomes another exercise like in ego. And what we really want to do is just basically connect people with their higher selves. We want them to, we shouldn't say we want them to, because that would be a function of the ego. But it seems to me that that the world is being transformed into this new paradigm where we are finding that our higher selves are the guidance system that's truly beneficial and appropriate and good for like this world. So given that, and if we're to foster and help and guide and cultivate that in other people as well as ourselves, it can't come from a place of like, well, you need to be a higher self, you need to squash the ego, blah blah blah, because that would be an egoic message, like from ego to ego. So I really think that it's this is something that keeps coming up, but it really seems to be the answer, and it's a completely new paradigm, is that the idea of just holding a space authentically, like holding a resonance in a space in yourself of resonating with your highest self, of being in association, in harmony with that side of you. In doing so, it's almost like the magnetic field that you will exude is going to resonate at a different frequency, and as it gets in contact with other magnetic fields, which is the way that it works on a physical level, maybe we're talking about astral or auric fields, but it may literally be a magnetic field. It's just that magnetic fields have some kind of qualitative property, like love or goodness or peace or even evil or darkness, or like that. Magnetic fields can actually carry a qualitative, like emotional or some other resonance that we're not able to measure through our physical sciences right now. But regardless, like, the feeling, like if someone's has a bad mood or bad energy and you're around them, you kind of pick it up, right? That's a very natural thing in general. Or if there's a lot of good moods, same thing. And so this idea that like what you really want to do is cultivate what you want in yourself, and then allow yourself to be in proximity with people without the intention. See, this is like the weird key that seems like, I'm not sure I figured it out 100%, but without the intention of changing them or fixing them or solving a problem. If you perceive there to be a problem, that something needs to be fixed or changed in another person or yourself, again, you're functioning from a place of ego. There's that certainty of knowing what's wrong and what's right, what's better and worse. You're certain about that. There's that fear that if you don't do the right thing, so you can tell like this is that ego energy. Instead, you kind of just are present and allowing whatever to happen is going to happen. And there's that sense of trust, acceptance, and love towards yourself and others. Yourself because, you're just being, and you can't expect that you're the one, you don't put that pressure on yourself to like change the world or fix things or anything like that. And same with the other person. And so it's like by not trying, all is accomplished.